This Kantian footnote comes from Kant's Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. This is from Book 4, Part 1 of the Religion. Book 4 is titled Concerning Service and Pseudo-Service Under the Sovereignty of the Good Principle, or Concerning Religion and Clericalism. And Part 1 of Book 4 is titled Concerning the Service of God in Religion in General. This is a long footnote. It takes up most of page 142 of this edition of the Religion. So I'll read you the footnote and the text on screen first, and then I'll walk through it line by line with what I think Kant is trying to say here. Here we go.
Religion is, subjectively regarded, the recognition of all duties as divine commands. Footnote. By means of this definition, many an erroneous interpretation of the concept of religion in general is obviated. First, in religion, as regards the theoretical apprehension and avowal of belief, no assertorial knowledge is required, even of God's existence, since, with our lack of insight into supersensible objects, such avowal might well be dissembled. Rather, is it merely a problematical assumption, hypothesis, regarding the highest cause of things that is presupposed speculatively, yet with an eye to the object toward which our morally legislative reason bids us strive, an assertorial faith, practical and therefore free, and giving promise of the realization of this its ultimate aim. This faith needs merely the idea of God, to which all morally earnest, and therefore confident, endeavor for the good must inevitably lead. It need not presume that it can certify the objective reality of this idea through theoretical apprehension. Indeed, the minimum of knowledge, it is possible that there may be a God, must suffice subjectively for whatever can be made the duty of every man. Second, this definition of a religion in general obviates the erroneous representation of religion as an aggregate of special duties having reference directly to God. Thus it prevents our taking on, as men are otherwise very much inclined to do, courtly obligations over and above the ethico-civil duties of humanity, of man to man, and our seeking perchance even to make good the deficiency of the latter by means of the former. There are no special duties to God in a universal religion, for God can receive nothing from us. We cannot act for him, nor yet upon him. To wish to transform a guilty awe of him into a duty of the sort described is to forget that awe is not a special act of religion, but rather the religious temper in all our actions done in conformity with duty. When it is said, we ought to obey God rather than men, this means only that when statutory commands regarding which men can be legislators and judges come into conflict with duties which reason prescribes unconditionally, concerning whose observance or transgression God alone can be the judge, the former must yield precedence to the latter. But were we willing to regard the statutory commands, which are given out by a church as coming from God, as constituting that wherein God must be obeyed more than man, such a principle might easily become the war cry, often heard, of hypocritical and ambitious clerics in revolt against their civil superiors. For that which is permissible, that is, which the civil authorities command, is certainly duty. But whether something which is indeed permissible in itself, but cognizable by us only through divine revelation, is really commanded by God, that is, at least for the most part, highly uncertain.
So let's walk through this line by line, sentence by sentence, and try to work out what Kant is telling us with this long footnote. First, the text. Religion is, subjectively regarded, the recognition of all duties as divine commands. What Kant is doing here is redefining religion. He's giving us a definition of religion in general, and it's going to be simply the identification of religious duty with ethical duty. religion consists of nothing other than our habit of thinking of our rational ethical duty, revealed by the categorical imperative, as being the will of a divine command giver. If we think of our ethical duty as divine commands, that's what religion is. It's nothing other than that. So here's the footnote then. By means of this definition, many an erroneous interpretation of the concept of a religion in general is obviated. So, the advantage of this definition, it avoids some of the problems that come up with other, more traditional definitions of religion. And Kant's going to enumerate these in this footnote. First, in religion, as regards the theoretical apprehension and avowal of belief, no assertorial knowledge is required, even of God's existence. Okay, pause right there. What is Kant telling us? First advantage of this new definition of religion is when we think about theoretical apprehension and affirmation of belief, telling people, saying in religious terms what they believe in, this new definition requires no assertorial knowledge, no assertions about the nature of reality are required. Why? Because this definition of religion is simply reconceiving of our ethical duty, known by the categorical imperative, under the category of divine commands. So he says, it requires no assertorial knowledge, not even of God's existence. So this new form of religion, this purified rationalist Christianity that is Kant's project in this work, does not even require us to assert that we know that God exists. We'll see more about that later in the footnote. Since, with our lack of insight into supersensible objects, such avowal might well be dissembled. Okay, so why is it that this new definition of religion does not require an assertion of God's existence? Because we have no way of knowing anything beyond the senses. We have no powers of discerning the nature of extrasensory reality, and therefore anyone who claimed or who vowed, yes, I believe in God, yes, I believe in the resurrection of the body, etc., might well be dissembling or lying. There's no way of knowing for sure what anybody's going to believe. This is all avoided with this new definition of religion, in which we reconceive ethical duty as being part of, as being the object of divine commands, as being divine commands. Kant continues, rather, it is merely a problematical assumption or hypothesis regarding the highest cause of things. Okay, problematical here, in contrast to assertorial, means we simply entertain it as a hypothesis, as a potential truth. Regarding the highest cause of things, that is presupposed speculatively, yet with an eye to the object toward which our morally legislative reason bids us strive. So, when we have the existence of God and all other beliefs of this rationalist religion will be merely problematical assumptions or hypotheses. God might exist, and if he did exist, his commands for me would be this table of ethical duties which I have discerned using reason and the categorical imperative, for example. Presupposed speculatively with an eye toward the object toward which our morally legislative reason bids us strive, right? That's ethical perfection, as following the categorical imperative consistently. An assertorial faith, practical and therefore free, and giving promise to the realization of this, its ultimate aim. This is faith that it leads us towards ethical perfection. This faith needs merely the idea of God, right? Not the reality of God, not certainty of God, not even the assertion of God, merely the potentiality that God might exist, to which all morally earnest and therefore confident endeavor for the good must inevitably lead. So our ethical action leads us towards this idea that a morally perfect being may exist. It need not presume that it can certify the objective reality of this idea through theoretical apprehension. This is the error of metaphysics, is to suppose that somehow this ethical uplifting that we experience when we contemplate our freedom and our dignity under the ethical law somehow should be connected with a set of assertions about the reality of extrasensible, supersensible objects or beings, including God. That's not where Kant is cutting off that avenue of thought right now. That's not where this new religion is going to go. Indeed, the minimum of knowledge, it is possible that there may be a God, must suffice subjectively for whatever can be made the duty of every man. So if our object here is to give a universal religion, rational religion that would apply to all of humanity, it can only have these very minimal knowledge requirements, not knowledge that God exists, or even the willingness to assert that God exists, or that one believes that God exists, merely an acknowledgement of the possibility of the existence of God, of some perfect being. And Kant thinks this comes automatically from the contemplation of the ethical reality of our lives at a high enough level of sophistication. So that's the first advantage that this new religion gives us, its minimal assertorial knowledge requirements. The second advantage Kant goes on to describe next. Second, this definition of a religion in general obviates the erroneous representation of religion as the aggregate of special duties having reference directly to God. I think he means by this the idea that religion consists of a set of special duties that are owed not to one's fellow man in the ethical and civil sphere, but vertically, so to speak, owed directly to God, an obligation to go to church, an obligation to pray in a certain way, to engage or not engage in certain activities. If these are direct obligations to God, they would be competing with ethical and civil obligations. Kant is going to eliminate that competition with this new definition of religion. Thus, it prevents our taking on, as men are otherwise very much inclined to do, courtly obligations over and above the ethico-civil duties of humanity, of man to man. So what's the problem here? If we have this set of special obligations owed directly to God, people will be inclined, I think here especially of Catholics, will be inclined to make them into a set of court manners. Think of the sort of elaborate rituals that are involved in court politics, in court in the court of a European monarch or European prince. People would begin treating duty to God in this fashion. You have to bow in a certain way. You have to address somebody by a certain title. All these things which will be regarded as being somehow vital to religion itself. Kant thinks this comes from an erroneous idea of religion as a set of special duties owed to some divine being. In fact, he's going to redefine it here as being ethical duty reconceived as divine command. And our seeking perchance even to make good the deficiency of the latter by means of the former. And here's the ethical hazard of a set of special duties, special religious duties, Kant thinks. People may begin trying to make up for the defect of their ethical and civil performance of duty by trying to substitute for it the performance of these special duties. Right? Well, I didn't do my ethical duty, but I was performing my religious duty instead, so I'm okay. I was doing something more important than ethical duty. Kant again wants to close off that avenue of competition, that substitution of divine duty for ethical and political duty. Kant continues, there are no special duties to God in a universal religion, for God can receive nothing from us. We cannot act for him, nor yet upon him. And we have here some of the basic presuppositions of this entire religion within the limits of reason alone project. To wish to transform a guilty awe of him into a duty of the sort described is to forget that awe is not a special act of religion, but rather the religious temper in all our actions done in conformity with duty. So what is awe? It is not a religious duty of its own, a religious act of its own, which indicates this vertical relationship to a divine being. Rather, it is the religious temper, the sort of religious flavor, as it were, of all of our ethical actions that we do in duty. So when I think about telling the truth, why? Because it's the categorical imperative, I may think of telling the truth also as obeying a commandment from a divine and perfect being. That's what this religious awe is. It's my recognition of the kind of majesty of the ethical law that's in me through reason, and my association of it with a sort of speculative, hypothetically held perfect being, or the divine lawgiver. And when it is said, we ought to obey God rather than men, this means only that when statutory commands regarding which men can be, legislators and judges, come into conflict with duties which reason prescribes unconditionally, concerning whose observance and transgression God alone can be the judge, the former must yield precedence to the latter. So, this quote from Scripture, from the Acts of the Apostles, we will obey God rather than you, Kant says all that means is that human-made civil law must yield to the categorical imperative, right? Because this new definition of religion, again, remember, is it's thinking of ethical duties as divine commands. So when we say, as rationalist Christians in the Kantian mode, we will obey God rather than man, all we're saying is that we will obey the rational requirements of the categorical imperative, which is internal to us and known through reason, rather than obeying civil legislation, positive law that is made by human beings and human legislatures and kings. That's all that means. It doesn't mean we have some sort of special access to divine law beyond the human and ethical world. Kant continues, but were we willing to regard these statutory commands, which are given out by a church as coming from God, as constituting that wherein God must be obeyed more than man? So suppose we took the Catholic alternative and believed that, yes, there really are these divine commands that the church interprets to us, which are more important than obeying the political authorities. In that case, such a principle might easily become the war cry, often heard, of hypocritical and ambitious clerics in revolt against their civil superiors. What happens? Kant is saying, I think, that you would license a type of clericalism. Now, corrupt and ambitious priests and bishops might declare to people, here is a divine duty which conflicts with your duty to your king, with your duty to your prince, with your duty to the civil society, to the city, to the state, and you should obey us, the clerics, the priests, the bishops, etc., instead of obeying the legitimately constituted civil authority. You have this potential for a war between the civil power and the religious power. So Kant, again, wants to shut down this competition by redefining religion as ethical duty thought of as divine command. He goes on, for that which is permissible, that is, which the civil authorities command, is certainly duty. So, first part of this sentence. We are certainly obligated to obey the civil authorities. So what they tell us to do, we must do. That is definitely a duty of ours. But, he continues, but whether something which is indeed permissible in itself, but cognizable by us only through divine revelation, that is to say, these things that the Church says are commanded by God, that are divine laws and divine duties, separate from the ethical and political duties that we can think of through reason and civil society, whether this is really commanded by God, that is, at least for the most part, highly uncertain. So what is Kant saying? In this type of conflict that the religious person or the Catholic is imagining, the civil obligation is certain. We know we must obey the civil authorities. This idea that somehow the church has access to some divine being and certain knowledge of this divine being and the duties owed to it, that is much less certain. That is of necessity uncertain because it draws upon this claim of knowledge of supersensible realities, which goes beyond what the human mind is capable of knowing with certainty. So we should prefer the ethical, civil duty instead. So that's been my walkthrough of this long footnote from page 142 of Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. I hope you found it edifying. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.